Yeah.
He has a very nice back of head.
There you go.
And then you can pull up a little closer too. Good. You're there.
Yeah.
That looks good.
Love my American citizen.
Do you want to give less headroom, maybe? Yeah, too much headroom right there. Yeah, that's better. And then maybe just center it a little bit? Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah.
Okay. Are we on?
Yes.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. This we originally planned to have as a private session here, but since people signed up from around the world, we're now recording it and we'll make it available that way. The topic is extremely important and utterly ignored right now, and that is Afghanistan and the United States, Afghanistan and the region, Afghanistan, of course, and itself. And our purpose is not to propound any particular thesis either on Afghanistan or its future place in the world, but rather to begin the process of gathering the best thinking available on the subject, and because it's not avoidable. Afghanistan did not cease to exist. It's still there. It still poses a challenge, maybe opportunities for the rest of the world, and it's these that we want to analyze, and we couldn't do better than the group we have today. David Sedney, old friend, served, my goodness, many years in Afghanistan and on Afghanistan with the U.S. military, took a very active and significant and positive role in that, and then he has also been a loyalist in terms of the American University of Afghanistan, which still exists, thank goodness, in the Gulf, and he served as president of the American University of Afghanistan as well. Scott Worden is the Director of Afghanistan and Central Asian Programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace. He was Acting Director of Policy and Senior Policy Advisor for the Office of Afghanistan and Pakistan Affairs at USAID. And then we have our old friend Sami Mahdi, co-founder and editor-in-chief of Amu TV, former bureau chief of Radio Azadi, which is Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Afghanistan, and a strategic advisor to Tolo News. David, lead us in.
Thanks very much, Fred. Thank you very much for doing this, because as you said, Afghanistan is a subject that certainly here in Washington, and actually most other capitals that I'm familiar with, not many people want to talk about Afghanistan, not many people want to listen about Afghanistan, and particularly here in the United States, people want to put Afghanistan behind them. It's interesting, when I talk to groups about Afghanistan here in the U.S., many of them think that the U.S. won the war. Now, of course, the U.S. lost the war, but many Americans think that the U.S. won the war. They're not really sure why they think that, because they don't really know very much. But in fact, as I said, the U.S. lost the war. And looking ahead, which I think is the purpose of this, also, however, involves looking back. As Fred said, I was the president, actually twice the president of the American University of Afghanistan in Kabul, still on the board of trustees and still serve in a number of different capacities, volunteering with the university, one of which is advising students, alumni, and staff. And it's amazing how many of them are optimistic that the Taliban will somehow go away soon, and they're looking for ways they can help after the Taliban leave. I have a different perspective, and my perspective is shaped in many ways by I would say an historical perspective. Because if you look at other ideological movements which have taken power in the country over the past 100+ years, you will see that they don't go away quickly. And I'll start with mentioning the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, where a very small group of Bolsheviks, Fred will know the number better than I do, took over a country, and many people would say they still rule it today. But certainly up until 1991, they ruled it formally. Or if you look at China, where I spent many years, the Chinese communists took over in 1948, and they still rule it today. If you look at Afghanistan's neighbor, Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini and his cohort took over Iran in 1979, and they're still very much in control. We can go on. We can talk about Vietnam. We can talk about Cambodia. We can talk about other places. The Taliban took over Afghanistan in the late 1990s, and the only reason they were pushed out was really an accident of history. That they hosted Osama bin Laden attacked the United States, and I think we all know what happened. But then the Taliban continued, and eventually they're back where they started. The Taliban government today is almost identical in every respect, including all the key personalities to the government that ran off to Pakistan in 2001. So these are larger historical processes, and I think it's important to look at and analyze that. And if you're hoping for some kind of immediate turnaround in Afghanistan, you need to look at these other ideological movements that have taken over. But at the same time, those of us from the United States, people like myself who used to be in the foreign policy making process, many people who are friends of mine, people I used to work with, are still making foreign policy in the US. So are there policy directions that the United States should take in years ahead that will advance US national interest in Afghanistan, but also be aware of history? And here I'll give you a personal anecdote. In 1984, I joined the US State Department, and I was posted on the Eastern European desk. One of the jobs of the Eastern European desk was to deal with the embassies of various countries. One of the people who I was working with, he had the job of working with the embassies of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Because even though they had been absorbed into the Soviet Union in 1944, 1945, when the Soviet Union conquered them as it moved forward against Germany, their embassies remained not just physically there in Washington, they remained active. They had ambassadors, they had staff, and they served as a center of activism for Lithuanian Americans, Estonian Americans, Latvian Americans, many of who kept their language, who kept their culture, who kept their identity, all the way up to 1989, when those countries became free again, and those embassies continued to operate. That role that those embassies played didn't play a determining role in what happened in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. That was a much larger issue that was falling apart of the Soviet Union. But those embassies helped those peoples, the Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian people, be ready for what might happen. And they were. And many of those people who were involved with the embassies who had participated in the various cultural, educational, language, and other activities, then went back to Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania and played key roles in the development of new countries. And during the preceding 40 plus years, they had been preparing for that. They didn't know when it would happen, they didn't know how it would happen, but they still were preparing. And so I would offer that that's something that the United States should, a historical lesson that the United States should be taking. Now, unfortunately, the U.S. government made a really bad decision in 2021 after the Taliban took over, and it closed the Afghan embassy in the United States. It kicked out the accredited ambassador and all of the diplomatic staff that were there. Unlike other countries, the Afghan embassy in the United Kingdom, the Afghan embassy in Canada, the Afghan mission to UN agencies in Geneva, and a number of other places, they continue to operate with the staff that they had. How are they able to do that? Financially, because there's huge demand for things like notarizing birth certificates, various consular functions which generate revenue. And they've been able to do that. Now, some countries, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, others have closed, have turned over the Afghan embassy premises and kicked out the kicked out the Republic's diplomats and replaced them with Islamic Emirate diplomats. But the United States took a halfway thing. It didn't invite the Taliban in because we do not recognize the Taliban, but we kicked the Islamic Republic people out. So one of the suggestions that's been made by Lisa Curtis at the Center for American Security and others has been that the United States reopen the embassy and allow a group of former diplomats of the Republic of Afghanistan to begin operating the consular and other activities there, and rather than just having this empty building that the United States is now the caretaker of. I think that's a policy step the United States could and should take. The U.S. State Department will not take it on its own. It would have to come about as a result of pressure, primarily pressure from Congress. And that's an area where Afghans in the United States could play a role in pressuring, pushing, urging members of Congress to put language for reopening that embassy into various bills, and that would put some pressure on the administration. Whether it would lead to anything quickly, I don't know, but it would be something that people could do now. It's based on the history, and it does provide an avenue for those Afghans who are interested in preparing to return to a post-Taliban Afghanistan, a place that could be a center of their activities. So I've tried to put what I think is a long-term, or the near and immediate term in historical context. The chances of the Taliban leaving on their own are zero, in my view. The chances of the Taliban disappearing in something are, barring another cataclysmic event like 9/11, are not feasible or not really worth thinking about. But the Taliban, I think, will, at some point, face challenges and may either adapt or leave. And there is, I think, something concrete that the United States government could do and that Afghan Americans could do to make that more likely. And with that, Fred, I'll turn it back over to you and for others. And I have other ideas as well, but that's, I think, a concrete one that I wanted to put forward in the context of this, of the topic that you put forward, and I think it sort of hits the...
It does indeed, and thank you very, very much. Scott.
Great, thank you. Nice to see all of you, and thanks for having me back here. To those watching online, thanks for your interest. What I thought I would do in my opening remarks is to talk about three things. One, what is my summary based on lots of conversations with people in and around the administration on U.S. interests in Afghanistan? Secondly, what are the broader geopolitical and regional trends that are going to affect Afghan's future, but also shape U.S. policy and options? And then third, maybe most controversial or most uncertainly, talking about how U.S. politics and our upcoming election might affect things or not. I mean, first of all, U.S. interest in Afghanistan, I've heard an articulation of 6 different overlapping interests. And I'll just run through them and then I'll talk a little bit about where I see each one being addressed or not. So, counterterrorism, first and foremost, no attack on the U.S. homeland or allies originating from Afghanistan. Second of all, the status of U.S. detainees, and there are a few U.S. citizens that are the subject of ongoing negotiations, I understand, between the Taliban and U.S. diplomats. Third, evacuation of Afghans, particularly special immigrant visa holders, but more generally, trying to, on our own side, as well as in negotiations with the Taliban, ensure freedom of movement for those Afghans that we've committed to helping, we being the U.S. I'm numbering them, but I realize there's not necessarily a hierarchy or a degree of interest. So another is women's rights and human rights. And my fifth on the list is humanitarian assistance and economic development, so making sure Afghanistan doesn't collapse from a humanitarian need standpoint, but also trying to reduce U.S. commitments to Afghanistan. And then lastly, and maybe most abstractly, is trying to maintain an international diplomatic consensus on the broad conditions and expectations that we have for the Taliban, which include, in the end game, a more inclusive society that is not a threat to itself or its neighbors, as well as these U.S. interests. So that in a nutshell, and it's a mixture of things. There's some that are hard to obtain, there are some that are more bureaucratic and discreet in terms of U.S. Citizens. But that's a range of U.S. interests in Afghanistan going forward. And then, of course, as David mentioned, and I think many of us feel personally at least, there is an obligation to support Afghanistan that the U.S. engaged in so deeply, for better and for worse. So, but that is not fundamentally an ongoing policy interest, at least this administration or the next one is likely to prioritize. So when we look at this list, I want to just give my own kind of quick assessment on how things stand. The counterterrorism front is an interesting picture. It's mixed. Obviously, there's been no attack on the homeland or allies. The attack on Russia that's been attributed to ISIS-Khorasan is an interesting exception. It shows the potency of a movement, ISIS-K, that is headquartered in Afghanistan. We don't know, of course, exactly what the connections are with attackers that were in Moscow. It's not an ally, but it is a warning that unchecked violent extremist groups in Afghanistan, have and will continue to have capability to reach out. TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, are an issue that is also not, let's say, a direct threat to obviously the homeland or our official allies, but Pakistan is a major security interest, nuclear armed, over 200 million people. So the inability of the Taliban, actually the willingness of the Taliban to give safe haven to the TTP is a negative on the counterterrorism front. And then Al-Qaeda, there's less information there. They seem to be a less potent threat. U.S. intelligence assesses that they still exist, but I think the Taliban have a strong incentive per the U.S. agreement with the Taliban to suppress their activities. I think that in conclusion, my assessment is that the U.S. believes that there is the minimum acceptable compliance with counterterrorism, so as not to go into a new escalatory phase, whether that's drone attacks on the Taliban or otherwise. So they're doing okay in a realistic assessment on counterterrorism for U.S. goals. U.S. detainees, or what might be termed hostages, that's I have less information about, but I understand that this is an ongoing issue that is the source of active diplomacy. Evacuation of Afghans, it sounds like freedom of movement has maintained a steady pace. I don't know, but I perceive that the obstacles to increasing the numbers of Afghans that come out are largely on immigration law, whether it's the U.S. or in other partners, in terms of finding places where there's support and visas and so forth. Much worse, the worst in all of this, is women's rights and human rights. There's been no movement by the Taliban on the clearly expressed international desire to have women in school. We started a new school year, again, with public schools closed entirely to girls over the age of 6th grade, as well as universities. And in fact, it's getting worse. USIP on our website tracks published edicts, decrees, whether officially promulgated or stated in news conferences by the Taliban, and the restrictions keep increasing over time. Humanitarian assistance, what we see, I think, is a distracted global attention on this. Of course, we have a terrible situation in Gaza, we have a terrible situation in Sudan, Ukraine. The needs keep increasing, and what we'll see is a slow but steady decline over time of economic assistance to Afghanistan. At the same time, the economy, while not in total collapse, is not growing. So this is only going to put more pressure on the Afghan people. And then finally, in terms of the international consensus, on this. I think it's an interesting story. It's kind of a two-level issue. On the one hand, it's remarkable that no country in the world has recognized the Taliban. Now 2.5, coming up on 3 years into their rule. That is amazing. On the other hand, what you have is a divergence between, let's say, Western allied interests that have more of a priority on human rights and women's rights, and the region, which both has less of a priority on that, which is the Taliban's worst performance in terms of these metrics I laid out, but also it's their neighbor, and they have economic interests, they have security interests that they have to address by engaging. So what you have is de facto recognition or increased practical engagement amongst most, if not all, the countries of the region versus a more distant, more Western arm's length. That said, the U.S. is pursuing a policy of, I would say, quiet engagement. And I think I would divide it between bureaucratic engagement to try to achieve these objectives I said, in terms of humanitarian assistance, in terms of U.S. citizens, in terms of counterterrorism, if not cooperation, at least mutual understanding. So there is engagement. Tom West, our special representative, does meet with the Taliban. But at the political level, above that, there's non-recognition, and there's not wanting to legitimize the Taliban. Are these in contradiction? Can this dualism sustain over time? That is a good question. But I do see a cleavage developing where over time the region will engage more and more, almost inevitably, to achieve their economic and security interests. Not that they like the Taliban, but they feel like talking to them is better than not. And there will probably be less attention and less feeling toward engagement over time. And David mentioned these, I think I agree with you without the historical knowledge that you're bringing to this, that these authoritarian regimes that the U.S. firmly opposes have a way of persisting over time. So, adding to that list, we had a policy of isolation toward Cuba for decades. It might not have been a constructive policy as far as effectuating change in our interests, but it was very politically comfortable for the U.S. To have a posture of isolation, likewise with Iran and some other countries. So I'm afraid that disengagement and non-recognition can persist even if it's not producing results. The final thing I'll say, and maybe we can come back to this more in discussion, and others will have probably equally valid views to me in terms of the U.S. political landscape. But I think that either way the U.S. election turns out in November, I'm not seeing a particularly positive sign for increased assistance or increased engagement with Afghanistan. If the current administration prevails, I think there has been this trend, clearly an explicit policy to focus on the Indo-Pacific, which Afghanistan is not a part of. You'll maintain our core national security and counterterrorism interests, but I think the increased focus on China and the Pacific will continue unless there is a much more acute crisis in Afghanistan, which I think nobody in this audience wants. If it's a Trump administration, I think the trend is that more conservative, the Republicans prefer coercion to engagement when you're talking about regimes that we don't have much in common with. So yes, there's the wild card of potential making a great deal, but I think the odds of support for armed opposition would increase. I'm not predicting that would be a decision. Leaving aside whether that's good or bad, it would certainly, I think, atomize the environment and add more conflict dimension to it. So I'll stop there and turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you, Scott. Sami.
Thank you so much, Dr. Starr and everyone. As a citizen of Afghanistan, I'm very happy to see my country is still a topic of discussion in your capital. Thank you for this. As a journalist, my job is to pay attention to what people say. So, I've been listening to Mullah Hibatullah, the leader of the Taliban. And I think the guy doesn't need any interpretation or any spokespersons. He speaks very, very well. He is hidden, but every time he speaks volumes. Just listen to his recent speech for the Eid Fitr. What he said. I think the U.S. policy on Afghanistan was based on some basic assumptions. The most important one was that Taliban have changed. There is a Taliban 2.0, which have learned some lessons from the past, from 90s. They will cooperate with the United States, especially on counter-terrorism and security. Taliban have a monopoly over use of coercive power and violence in Afghanistan. Given the Doha deal, which played an instrumental role in bringing back the Taliban to the power, the United States, I think, expected the Taliban would adopt a more US-friendly foreign policy. And fifth, American financial aid to the country, humanitarian aid to the country, would push the Taliban to adopt a more US-friendly foreign policy. And, it will be a tool to leverage the Taliban. But as I say, as a journalist, as I am trying to watch the situation, what's happening, I think all of these assumptions were proved false and wrong. There is minimum evidence to show Taliban have changed or learned anything from the past. As David mentioned, they are like copy-pastes of Taliban in 1990s, in every sense. Even their ministers, their provincial governors, almost everyone is the same. Especially when it comes to human rights, women's rights, and minorities' rights. You don't see any changes in Taliban's conduct of these issues today compared to 90s. They have kept their relations with Al-Qaeda, and it's evident in the US Pentagon reports, as well as reports by the UN and other actors, repeatedly. ISK is growing in the country, even compared to the days of the Republic. It's evident, again, in the statements of the Joint Chief of Staff. Recently had a hearing at the Congress, and also General McKenzie and others. In the past 2.5 years, Taliban's monopoly over coercive power and violence is challenged. Taliban are not the only group who have monopoly over use of violence. We see that ISK is challenging the Taliban. They have killed at least 2 provincial governors, very important ones, one in Badakhshan and another in Balkh. They have killed at least 1 provincial police commander in Badakhshan, and have killed one of very important military commanders who occupied Kabul, one of the first people who came to Kabul. Besides ISK, there is some grassroots resistance against the Taliban, like the National Resistance Front and also Freedom Front. They have been challenging the Taliban every day. Today, before I started driving to this event, the last report I saw on my desk was 3 Taliban members were killed by National Resistance Front forces in Kabul. So this is happening almost every day. Every day there is news about Taliban members being killed by these other groups. So that assumption of monopoly over coercive power and violence is also challenged and has proved false. Taliban are much closer to the United States adversaries in the region. There is a new report by Bush Institute, which was released last week. It says there was 67 official meetings between Taliban and Iranian officials within 3 months. It says a volume about the relationship between Taliban. I think the closest relationship now Taliban enjoy is with the Iranian regime now. Russia speaks of delisting Taliban from the blacklist of terrorism. Chinese president was the first president in the world to accept, Taliban ambassador formally. So adversaries of the Taliban, of the United States, have much closer relationship with the Taliban now, and the idea or assumption that humanitarian aid will bring the Taliban closer to the United States was also proved wrong. American financial aid to the country, unfortunately, has brought minimum results. The population is starving, unfortunately, and the poverty is overwhelming. It's apparent in every single report by media or international organizations. And there are numerous reports by SIGAR and other entities that Taliban are abusing these humanitarian aid. Although the United States, the Biden government administration has repeatedly said that these reports are not going into the hands of the Taliban, but there are other reports which says Taliban have been abusing these financial aid, especially that Taliban have banned all former NGOs operating inside the country. They just 2 weeks ago announced that all NGOs from the past are banned, and they have to come back and re-register if they want to operate inside the country. So they have done the same to the political parties and others. Let me come back to Hibatullah's speech in Eid. He said that jihad continues for another 20 years. He said that the suicide attackers should stay alert and ready for new attacks. He said that yesterday the US was bombing them with B-52s, and now the United States and its allies are bombing the Taliban with propaganda. So basically, from his point of view, the sense of animosity is not gone. It's still there. US is still the number one enemy for the Taliban. And the tools that the United States is using is media and propaganda. He says that he is a follower of the God, and his followers who are ready to sacrifice themselves for this cause will go to the heaven. And the adversaries are followers of Satan. I don't see any changes in this narrative compared to 1990s and in the past 20 years. So I will make it short. My personal observation and policy recommendation. I think the new administration after elections in the United States should do a full review and assessment of its policy towards Afghanistan and the situation in Afghanistan. So it could, provide a new policy given the new realities on the ground, as well as based on the behavior of the Taliban in the past 2 years. More communication and transparency is needed on Afghanistan. We don't hear much from the US administration about Afghanistan. We really don't hear much. We hear only when there is a conference or something like Doha, something is happening, then we hear from the US administration something from Afghanistan, about Afghanistan. As a journalist, I would ask for more transparency and more communication on Afghanistan from the US government. More investment on education is crucial and vital for Afghanistan. The reason that women are still standing and resisting, I think it is because of the education our population got in the past 20 years. And thanks to institutions like American University of Afghanistan and others. Engagement with other groups. Don't be just Taliban-centric in your engagement. Engagement with other groups, including the very important diaspora that we have now, including in the United States, Northern America, Europe, and other places. Following what David suggested about reopening our embassy in Washington, D.C., I would say bringing together members of our diplomatic missions who are still operating to become like a shadow political opposition to the Taliban and to represent Afghanistan in international arena would prove very, very important, because we now lack that voice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, all of you. This is not do you agree or do you disagree situation, because you could agree with everyone and still be totally puzzled. The floor is open for brief comments or questions. Well, we've cowed you into silence.
I'll ask a question to David, and also Sami mentioned this in terms of a diplomatic mission. You've been a diplomat, you know how it works in the U.S. system. How practical is it to open a diplomatic mission here, and what kind of structure you propose, and how can we advocate for that? Because that's really needed. You talked about notarizing birth certificates. I got my daughter's passport extended all the way in Australia. Our ambassador was here, so he's a close friend and CAMCA member. So I gave him my daughter's passport to get it, extended there and sent back here. But it's not just about passport. It's about everything. About working with diaspora. All the. So in terms of how practical it is.
Well, it's a lot harder now that the U.S. closed the embassy, because there would be large political repercussions with the Taliban if the U.S. were to take that step. And while Scott said his list was not necessarily in priority order, it was priority order, except for the fact that women's rights and human rights are actually at the very bottom of the U.S. agenda. And I had to insist on that. The U.S. talks about them, but in terms of the U.S. actual agenda, it's at the bottom. But the two issues that Scott mentioned first, counterterrorism, second and third, counterterrorism, the U.S. citizens who are detained by the Taliban right now. And there's an article about one of them, Mr. Corbin, I think his name was. His family had asked it have it kept secret. There are others whose families are asking it to be kept secret. So there's no public number of how many there are, but there's definitely more than one. And then the ability to move the SIVs and the refugees, the so-called P1s and P2s out. Those are leverage that the Taliban has that they could cut off if that happened. So I don't think there's something that could happen right away, but it could happen. And this is not about, I have to take a little objection to Scott's summary, but nothing about loyalty to the past. This is a different agenda. The U.S. government doesn't have this agenda, but those of us outside the U.S. government can suggest new ideas. One agenda for the U.S. should be to help prepare for a post-Taliban Afghanistan, whatever that may be. And that was actually our agenda in supporting those embassies in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. We kept them there in preparation for the day that those countries would become free again, and they did. And so whenever that happens, whether it's in 10 years or 60 years or 100 years, that there's a change in the regime in Afghanistan, it's better to be ready for it than not ready. We weren't ready for it in 2001, and we made huge mistakes from 2002, 3, 4, 5, 6, all the way to the very end. A lot of them because we didn't know what we were doing, and we didn't do a good job of helping Afghans build their own society. So number one, it would be very hard politically. just because it's hard doesn't mean you shouldn't start. Is it practical? Yes, it's practical, and I think there's a pamphlet or a policy paper that Lisa Curtis and her colleagues at the Center for New American Security have put out describing that. But will it be quick and easy? No. So that would be my view on that. But on the other side, if you don't start doing it, then it'll never happen. And your situation is the same. So many Afghans who are in the U.S., they go to Canada because the Afghan embassy in Canada is still open. So there's a huge demand for those sort of things. And that's something that I think should be met rather than forcing all these Afghans to go to Canada or the UK or Australia or whatever.
Yes,
Sorry,
please.
I think you asked Sami as well. This year?
I think you answered.
Okay, all right.
I'm just wondering, a question. During the period when the U.S., when the international forces were there and women were going to school, they were opening businesses, they were part of the economic life of Afghanistan, and they evidently did quite well opening businesses, especially if there was some seed money from some sort of project, international aid or something. They put together businesses, right? And this helped the Afghan economy grow. And now, it's now that there's increasing poverty, the situation is really bad, women are put down, not allowed to again participate in the economic life, let alone be educated or teach their own children. You know, it's like it's a self-inflicted wound to Afghanistan. Is the religious right to put women down in these positions, is that so important that it doesn't matter that babies are dying, that the economy is going to ruin, but it's God's will that we suffer? Is that?
I think it's Mullahibatulah's will, not God's will. I think Taliban interpretation of Islam has been challenged by hundreds of thousands of clerics and imams around the world, around the Islamic world. So it's only Taliban's interpretation. We have been a Muslim country for over a millennia, and our girls went to education, to schools. We have these beautiful poems from female poets. We have big names in our history, like Rabia Balkhi and so many others. Okay, so in the past 100 years, women always went to school. During the Mujahideen regime, government from 92 to 96, there was no ban on girls' education. They were also coming from the same ideology, from the same background, but they were not a Taliban. So this is a unique approach to interpret Sharia, and I think it has nothing to do with the God. It has everything to do with Mullahibatullah.
Yeah, well, that's my point.
Yeah.
Yes, please. Come back.
Me.
Please.
Okay. Thank you. Two things I want to take your opinion and also how you assist the situation. First thing is in terms of engagement. We work on international legal capabilities using mechanisms including gender apartheid, OCC, and ICJ. We see so much claims that it can work as an impediment to engagement in normalization process. Well, we see that as more of monitoring over a political process that can go parallel to Doha format if it happens, or anything else you may understand or want to pursue. But the thing is, for engagement, they keep saying that any accountability measurement can discourage Taliban to change their behavior. But my question question has always been, and I don't know really how to communicate it with certain politicians, is okay, you have been very conciliatory and appeasing towards Taliban since the peace process from 2008 and then got serious about 2018 started. That's one thing. And another bizarre thing that is
Excuse me,
really,
can you state your question, please?
yes, so what do you think of engagement now? That they want to persuade without any principles and monitoring accountability mechanisms in place that will lead to normalization of the Taliban?
Scott?
Good question. I mean, I think that there's been a problem in the international and Afghan discourse about the definition of engagement and its meaning, the literal definition, but also its implications. And it'd be interesting in David's thoughts if he has any. I'm not a professional diplomat, but you have to engage. I am a peacemaker, peace builder, and you have to engage with your enemies in terms of literally having dialogue, having a meeting, talking to people in order to address differences or criticize, and we certainly do that on the women's rights issue. So if we define engagement as discourse, as exchange of views, sometimes in person, it shouldn't be a debate in my book. You have to meet the Taliban, talk to them, tell them what's good, what you want, and so forth, and listen. And I don't think that engagement per se equals legitimacy. Again, because you engage with your enemies, we had a Cold War, we had robust diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union for that entire time. But it's misperceived. On the larger issue of accountability, and this is something that I think is really important. My understanding, again, David is a professional diplomat, you can opine, is there's a general aversion by diplomats to legal accountability mechanisms because they are slow and they're rigid and you can't pivot very easily. It's not to say they don't want accountability, but if you label the Taliban, for example, and I think it would be a good idea personally, a gender apartheid regime, what that means, then it's harder to negotiate with them or to recognize or what have you. So I think there is that tactical, let's say, consideration in terms of if you have a potent public either indictment or a label like gender apartheid, can you then not negotiate on counterterrorism or on hostages or on detainees? So I think that's the issue. But fundamentally, if we look at the long-term trend, and I agree with a lot of Sami's characterizations, I think it's obvious the Taliban are not actually bargaining on any of the rights issues, and they're getting more conservative and extreme. So, pursuing an accountability mechanism, whether it's in the courts or in the court of public opinion, seems like the moral thing to do, and fundamentally needs to be pursued to have an effect over time.
I'd like to complicate this a little bit. There are two dimensions here. One is what let me call the human rights dimension, and these have been clearly stated here today, and they're very serious issues. They're not to be neglected, shoved under the rug. They're real. Don't need to go into and don't need to repeat all the elements of that. At the same time, there is another set of issues which we really haven't dealt with, and my question will be how do we bring these? How do you balance these properly? What are the other issues? Well, first of all, I think in this discussion we've grossly underestimated the degree to which the Taliban has gained acceptance. I was at the big meeting in Tashkent where I think 86 countries or something like that were present, including Russia and China at the foreign minister level, and a big group of Taliban people. And they all said, no, we're not going to recognize you. And they all said sort of clever, however, I understood, checking with individuals, including the Chinese, and what would it take? Well, if they were to allow more education for women, then we'll recognize it. Well, that's something you could play poker over that one. My point is this: even though they don't officially recognize, Chinese do, but no one else does, nonetheless, they all have charge d'affaires in Kabul. And they are all receiving charge d'affaires from Kabul. And if you ask any of them, including all their neighbors in Central Asia, they will say these charges are operating functionally as ambassadors. So don't buy no one recognizes them. That's no longer the case. That's the first thing. Second thing, there are a whole lot. This entire discussion takes place in a vacuum, as if there are no other countries. You know, Iran has been mentioned, bravo. Pakistan was mentioned. But what about, this is part of Central Asia. And the other countries of Central Asia all have intimate interests in Afghanistan, which they consider part of their region. Let me just quickly run through them. The Kyrgyz want to get their electricity out to Pakistan through Afghanistan. The Uzbeks have 10 different issues, obviously, including their close relationship with the business community in Mazar-e-Sharif. The Tajiks, my goodness, they're all over the place. And by the way, they're quick to point out that the Tajiks who were had up in Moscow for the crocus thing were actually from Tajikistan. They weren't Afghans. And their common language of that group, of the Islamist group in Khorasan group in Russia, is Russian. These are people who were probably recruited in Russia, but that's an aside. The point is, Russia has taken that issue, gone to the Taliban and said, hey, we're against them too. They have, in a sense, usurped our role as opponents of Islamic extremism, bizarre as it may seem. Then Kazakhstan, huge trade with Russia this year, and they just proposed to double it next year. And it's both export and import. Turkmenistan is leaving aside the Tapi thing, which is still going on with financial discussions in the Middle East and very extensive. They also have their Turkmen in Afghanistan, about whom they're concerned. So they're all extremely engaged. And for example, yes, you can say they're all opposed to the Afghans stealing all the water from the Amu Television. On the other hand, they are saying bring the situation of all of the Central Asians together is bring them into the water discussion. Don't push them out, bring them into the water discussion. So this is something that we have absolutely neglected. And furthermore, what we have neglected is the most important thing is all the Central Asians, aside from viewing Afghanistan as part of Central Asia, they all see that if they don't have a direct route to the Southern Sea, to Indian subcontinent, on to Southeast Asia, they're screwed, basically. Why? Because they have no one to deal with but Russia and China. They'll be dominated by them totally. Now, is that of interest to us? Is that relevant? And does that enter our discussion of this issue? No, it doesn't. That we have encapsulated the Afghan issue with a certain amount of pluses and minuses that have been elegantly set forth here today, but we've isolated it from the bigger world, and we can't do that. What we don't acknowledge is the price we pay for the current policy that we're taking. I don't mean the price we pay vis-a-vis Afghans, but vis-a-vis the world. Have we put ourselves into a corner in which others are basically, to use the German phrase, stealing the raisins out of our cake? Are we self-isolating by our isolation of the Afghan issues from the region as a whole?
Sorry, I have to respond both to what Scott said and to your question, and particularly to what Fred said, because while I didn't mention Central Asia, it's actually very close to my heart. I offered one policy prescription for one country, which is the United States, and I would have mentioned Central Asia if I decided to take more time. But first, to go back to your question about engagement, and as somebody who was at one point was a professional diplomat, professional diplomats always say engagement is a good thing, but engagement means something commitment on both sides. So empty talk, just sitting there and talking to somebody who talks back to you, exchanges views, is often a bad thing. And if that talk gives them legitimacy, if by just sitting down to the table with somebody gives them legitimacy that you get nothing out of, if they get something, they get legitimacy, but you get nothing, then that is bad. So sometimes engagement can be bad and can be counterproductive to your interest. You should only engage with somebody if you are going to get something out of it for your national interest. So engagement for engagement's sake, I would offer from the standpoint of a professional diplomat, is a stupid idea.
But doesn't it work in the reverse also? Non-engagement as a policy is fine as long as you're getting something out of it.
Right, yeah, exactly.
But if you're not,
then you should engage. So, sorry, I have three other things I'm going to talk about, but I understand you want to respond. So, for engagement to make sense, your understanding has to be accurate. And Sami has made a very accurate point that the U.S. understanding of Afghanistan, its hopes for Afghanistan, its belief that there was an Afghanistan 2.0. A lot of people have wrote papers about Afghanistan 2.0. What's this group? The International Crisis Group has a guy who's always writing about how great the Taliban are, all this stuff. If you want to know his name, I'll tell you later. But in any case, there are all these people who've been selling a view of the Taliban that the facts, as Sami pointed out, have shown aren't true. Because if you look at what Mullah Hibatullah says, and what Mullah Hibatullah does, and what the Taliban in Kandahar do, you realize that that is completely wrong. And so if your assumptions are wrong, then your ability to get anything out of engagement is not only lacking, but what you're going to do is make things worse, not better. And that's what I would say is some of what the U.S. has done. But we do have those two interests, counterterrorism and getting people out of Afghanistan, both Americans and Afghans, that are real interests that limit our ability to do anything else. In terms of Central Asia, I want to remind Fred that Tajikistan actually does not have they still have a Islamic Republic ambassador in Tajikistan. They also host the National Resistance Front that Sami talked about that's carrying out attacks inside Afghanistan. The Taliban are very unhappy with Tajikistan because Tajikistan is hosting very openly all of the people who are attacking and killing, as Sami pointed out, including yesterday, they're killing Taliban. So their headquarters is in Tajikistan, just as it was from 96 to 2001. And the ties between the groups, it's now the NRF, and before they had different names, Northern Alliance, whatever, and the top leadership of Tajikistan are very, very strong. And I personally don't think that they'll be broken in the near future. So it's more complicated than just that. But on the issue of formal diplomatic recognition, is it important? Well, the way to judge that is who's asking for it, the Taliban. It's the one thing they keep asking for. It's really clear that international recognition is really important to the Taliban. Of course, all of the lower level stuff that Fred's talking about is there, but I would say it's lower level. It's not particularly relevant to what the Taliban want. The Taliban can take that or leave it. The Taliban have made clear they don't care. Yes, Central Asia cares about Afghanistan, but Afghanistan doesn't care about the Taliban except for that really key phrase that Sami mentioned, that jihad has to continue. So what does jihad mean for the Taliban? Does it just mean Afghanistan, or does it mean other countries? And this is where I think Scott really forgot to mention that probably the most important attack that Daesh, ISK, but I'll call it Daesh, has carried out was not the Crocus attack in Moscow, but we pay a lot more attention to Moscow. It was a much more violent, much more bloody attack in Iran that took place about 6 weeks before that. And both of those attacks, Daesh has claimed convincingly, and there's no question that Daesh is behind those attacks, whether they were recruited in Russia, or wherever they were, Turkey, or whatever they but they have shown the ability to carry out fairly massive attacks. In the case of Iran, killing hundreds of people in Iran. And both the Russians and the Iranians are very unhappy right now with the Taliban for allowing this. One theory, not a theory that I can confirm, but the one theory that I've heard from people who follow Afghanistan more closely than I, is that the Taliban and Daesh have come to an accommodation. That Daesh will not go after Taliban so much. They'll continue to go after, but not as strongly. But they will go after Iran and Russia, and the Taliban won't do anything to stop them. And the Iranians and the Russians are actually really unhappy. I know this directly from both Iranians and Russians. They're unhappy that the Taliban did not stop these attacks. And the Taliban have not done anything to try and prevent future attacks. So it's a little different perspective than you presented. I take a little issue with Fred Starr with great trepidation, but I will do it in this case. So going back to the question, I'm sorry, I would appreciate, I think probably for our audience, if you would identify your by name and your organization, because you said you kept saying we, and you wanted to do a follow-up. Yes.
Well, let's
Okay.
hold off just one
So
second.
you answer.
We're really running out of time. I would like to suggest that we have viewed this issue geographically in isolation largely. Yeah, that Tajiks are concerned. By the way, this is above all 90% a Badakhshan issue, on both sides of the border. It is Dushanbe's fight with Horog and the same on the other side of the border. But leave that aside. I think the choice we have to make: are we going to view this in isolation, or are we going to view this fate of Afghanistan in a larger geographical context? I think that the pointed issue, the big pointed issue, is what kind of governments and societies are you going to have between the Korean-Chinese border on the east-north side and the Middle East on the other side. You could have, and what is our policy toward Afghanistan doing? Which kind of governance is going to prevail in that vast region? Now, Afghanistan, important as it is only a part of that issue. The bigger part is all of the rest of Central Asia. And I'm not suggesting a formula. I'm just saying we have failed to view this in its larger geopolitical context. And by doing so, we could achieve wonderful things in cooperation with or spanking the Taliban, fine. But we could also, by the way we handled the Afghan issue, we could have fostered the development of really oppressive states of a common kind, anti-democratic, anti-Western, all the way from China to the Middle East. If that's what you want, that's what you'll get. But we are not calculating from that perspective. On the contrary, we're focusing on one country, Afghanistan, in isolation. And it's only part of a bigger picture, and I don't see any thinking on that bigger picture at all.
I don't know if you want to talk about just a brief response. I mean, I think that is an aspirational view, and you make the argument eloquently. I'm not personally disagreeing, but I think that President Karzai banked on that kind of geopolitical argument as far as unwavering U.S. support. I think President Ghani, for a variety of reasons that we don't need to fully elaborate here, but he overestimated in a different way, but including based on strategy, the U.S. commitment. And you have a succession of presidents that have decided Afghanistan and Central Asia, hasn't gotten much investment either, is not worth it for that vision. So I'm not disagreeing with you in terms of the value, but I think that there is a problem that is bipartisan and over many administrations, including then right up to the Biden administration, which, as I said, certainly prioritizes competition with China and an Indo-Pacific strategy, and also thought it was not worth staying in Afghanistan for any of that. So, from a policy perspective, I see there not being much uptake for that vision. I'm curious, and we'll all see, right, as the situation with China evolves, we'll get into a neo-Cold War, we say that we don't want that framework, but dynamic where, once again, allies and democracies count. But so far, over the last 23 years, I think that argument's been around and it hasn't been taken up. So it needs to have some different dimensions to it for it to have attractiveness in a policy surface. That's my opinion.
So,
Yeah, I just wanted to add that the recent news is that Ansarullah of Tajikistan has changed its name and brand. Now it's Tehrik-e-Taliban Tajikistan. Yeah. So it says a lot about the influence of Taliban in Central Asia.
T, yeah.
That's one thing. And today also there was another news that Russia and Tajik forces in Afghanistan border, they were doing this
Exercise?
yeah, military exercise, maneuver. So
I'm sorry, they did what?
Exercise.
Joint military maneuvers.
Oh, of course,
Yeah.
because they do joint drugs.
yes, so
Oh, come on, how naive are you?
I think, as I said, it just explains the reality of the situation, the kind of the threat that they are feeling from the other side of Amu River. And let me also say that at the very beginning, after Taliban coming to power, there were rockets shot from this side of Amu area to Uzbekistan, and saying that it was IMU, Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan. I think Taliban are very clever, have been intimidating the region. Uzbekistan with IMU, Tajikistan with Tehrik-Taliban Tajikistan, Pakistan with TTP, and Iran with all these Baluch and other groups. And they have been very clever in this, and they get very good response from all these countries of the region. But the question is, how sustainable that is for regional and global security? If a group in the middle of Central Asia and South Asia intimidates everyone, and by saying that we will, export terrorism now Afghanistan has become the new, hub for international terrorism. How sustainable that is for regional and global security? That's one question. The second question is, I totally understand that countries do treat other countries in a transactional manner, but what about values that we say the United States and Europe and others are have been champions of, like democracy, human rights, women's rights? Are these really values? Do we really believe in these things? Or they are just, words without any meaning? For God's sake, Afghanistan is the only country in the entire world. Women are not allowed to go to school. Mullah Hibatullah, again in his Eid speech, said that there is only one mazhab or Islamic jurisprudence in Afghanistan, and that's Hanafi. That means ignoring 20% of the population, which are Shias. I mean, if there is any value in the world, I think we shouldn't forget about those values, especially about democracy.
Let me just complicate things. I won't go into citing specific prominent Afghans abroad who have made this argument, but it is out there, namely that we are talking about Taliban as if it's a unified and harmonious group, whereas, so this thesis goes, there is one crowd in Kandahar who certainly are singing in the keys that you've told us, and there are others, some of whom in Kabul have lived abroad for a couple of years, know how the rest of the world works, and realize that they have to deliver or they're dead. And the tension between these two is significant and growing. Now, I can't evaluate this, but it seems to me to ignore that hypothesis completely is not responsible when you're trying
Can I
to...
answer being the only person from that country in this
No,
table?
you're not. You're not to this side of the table. Please.
Okay, sorry. We have been hearing that there is more moderate Taliban, especially those who are coming from Doha, who signed the agreement with Ambassador Khalilzad. But where are they? When Mullah Haibatullah decided to close schools, where were they? When they decided to, not allow women to go to work and work for international NGOs, we didn't hear a single word from Mullah Baradar and others. So I hear that Taliban are not very unified group, but there is no opposition to Mullah Haibatullah. See, Sirajuddin Haqqani has militant groups. He has suicide attackers. If he wants to stop Mullah Haibatullah, and if he is considered to be the moderate Taliban, the head of Haqqani network, then he could. But he's not doing anything. I don't know from where this idea of moderate Taliban comes, and if they are any effective.
My question is, as Scotty indicated, Sami also, that there is no any threat from the Taliban to the US. It is at least it is not looking real as a reality currently. But what is the guarantee that that Taliban is like gravity, like like a gun? Anyone can use it and shoot against anyone in the world. So the question is, what is the guarantee? How we guarantee that they are not doing something against US? Now the Mullah Haibatullah is in the hand of Iran. They established a guard like the Iranian guard for the Supreme Leader. They established a guard for the Supreme Leader of the Parliament in Canada. So they are doing something very complicated. The Chinese also are involved with and Russia. So we don't know when the Taliban will do something against US.
I certainly didn't mean to say there was no threat. Oh, sorry.
And regarding the region, since the Taliban is there, do you think that there is any possibility for any regional cooperation or regional connectivity, or any program for regional integration in the region? Because
Growth of air flights
they isolated Afghanistan
all over the place
Yeah.
in the last year.
And the
Great increase in the number of flights. I'm not saying good or bad, but it's a fact.
And trade
Yeah.
continues.
Pardon?
Trade is continuing.
Trade
That's
has
true.
grown.
Yeah.
No, believe me, I don't think that the growth of contact trade initiatives from neighboring countries, from China, from Russia, I'm not evaluating whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm saying look at the facts and don't ignore them. Bring them into your conception. I don't see that happen. And I don't see, in terms of the United States, yes, we're focused. We continue to focus on Afghanistan like this, as if it's isolated from the world. But it's not. And I think a broader perspective, maybe it will reinforce exactly the perspectives you've offered, Sami, or others have offered, whatever. I'm an agnostic on that. I'm just saying, stop treating it as an isolated problem that you could ignore most of the time, and when you do focus on it, you don't have to see it in context at all.
Can I address yours?
Just one more.
Let Scott finish.
Okay.
Well, just to be brief, I mean, I think that there's a significant threat from Afghanistan to the homeland, and Afghanistan is one of the most dangerous places for transnational terrorism in the world. So let me be clear about that. What I was trying to say, if it wasn't clear, is that when you break it down and say, okay, what about Al-Qaeda? You know, the assessment from General Guerrilla and others is that they are, 6 to 18 months away from having operational capability. It's not imminent, and it seems that the Taliban indeed are suppressing their activity, and I think there probably is a bargain, of some kind. David was asserting it with ISKP, I don't know about that, but with Al-Qaeda that, we're not going to kick you out or publicly denounce you, but you can't attack or otherwise, all that stuff. When it comes to ISKP aviations and whether they're going to fight it, and then TTP, I think, is a regional threat, but not a threat to the U.S. homeland. So I want to break it down and be clear. I think in general, the extremism that's coming out, I think the increase of madrasa education, not per se, madrasas can be fine if it's a good curriculum, but jihadi madrasas that we're hearing about, there's lots of reasons to be very concerned about Taliban rule for extremism and violent extremism. But when you break the issue down to its commitments, that's what I was talking about.
This has been an extraordinary session, and maybe I'm naive in saying this, but I don't think I disagree fundamentally with anything that's been said from this podium today. And I think that's the essence of the problem, that these are all significant and valid insights and groups of insights. And the problem is, how do you balance them? How do you adjudicate among them? Do you choose? Do you balance? What do you do? But it seems to me, whatever we do forward, and it's time to start thinking again about Afghanistan, whatever we do, we've got to deal with the whole thing, the whole elephant, and not just the trunk or the tail or the tusk. We've got to see the whole thing and all the complexity which our wonderful panelists today brought, and for which we are all grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you.